States are offering incentives to get the COVID vaccine. How does this sound? Some free sports tickets, some free beer, free child care coverage that's really needed right now.
Yeah, that's for certain. Again, the president's goal is to have 70% of Americans with at least that first shot before the 4th of July. 11 Alive's Brittany Klein-Peter takes a closer look at how Georgia is faring.
Let's go into the summer freer and safer. Let's celebrate a truly historic Independence Day.
President Joe Biden is telling Americans this week that we're now in the vaccination sprint. He's hoping the 4th of July will mark a turning point in the pandemic with the goal of administering at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine to 70% of Americans by then. So far, 62.9% of adults have received at least one vaccine, according to the CDC. But experts say on a statewide level, at least 30 states probably won't even come close to 70%, including Georgia.
The vaccinations have really slowed down in Georgia, despite the heroic efforts of our vaccinators to bring those vaccines to people where they need them.
As of yesterday afternoon, only about 40% of Georgians had received at least one dose. And we've been hovering around there for weeks now. At the same time, we're seeing far fewer new COVID cases reported each day. A viewer reached out to us asking if it's because fewer people are getting tested and there's more of an emphasis on vaccines right now. We turn to microbiologist Dr. Amber Schmidt for perspective.
Obviously, if we aren't testing, we're unlikely to find disease. But if that were the case, we would expect that our PCR test positivity would be increasing and probably above 5%. But it's not.
Testing data shows the weeks before vaccines started to be distributed, about 35,000 PCR tests were being administered each day. As of yesterday, our 7-day average is closer to 12,000, down by 65% over the last 5 months. Dr. Schmidt says it all really comes down to whether the weekly testing data is enough to appropriately identify cases.
In a lot of rural spaces, there's no cases to report, and it's unclear if that's because there's no testing happening in some of those rural counties, or if there truly is no disease.
The Biden administration is now offering a variety of vaccination incentives, including free daycare at area YMCAs and giveaways from companies like Anheuser-Busch. Health experts tell me that even with these incentives, Georgia is facing different challenges when it comes to convincing people to get vaccinated due to politicalization of the vaccine.
That was Brittany Klein-Peter reporting. Now, the latest White House COVID report reveals Georgia counties, our state overall, continues to be impacted by the virus. Week over week, our new number of cases is still falling. Right now, we're averaging 286 cases a day. That's down 97% since our record set in January. Our positivity rate also remains under 3%. That's within the top 25 lowest in the country. But Georgia's ranking of COVID hospital admissions is within the top 3 highest. Wyoming and Kentucky are the only other states with higher rates. We also have yet to reduce our number of deaths at the same rate new cases are falling. That also leaves Georgia toward the bottom of its rankings. Right now, we're losing about 12 people per day. These numbers have been declining, but our rate is still higher than other states.